All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again to the Lubar Center here at Eckstein Hall, Marquette University Law School. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues. This is our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people who are doing interesting, important work in this region and beyond. Today, we're joined by Charlie Sykes. Many people in this room know Charlie Sykes from his more than 2 decades in talk radio in Milwaukee, but he's doing a lot of interesting things today, one of which we'll be spending a fair amount of time talking about. He is currently a commentator and analyst for MSNBC. He has, in recent weeks, worked on public radio that originates in New York for a national broadcast. In the days after the Trump administration took office, he is going to be doing some more work for public radio in the future. And he has written 9 books now, and this is the latest one. It's getting some buzz, How the Right Lost Its Mind. Charlie Sykes' book will be out, a week from today?
Today.
A week from today, and we're going to be talking about that and much more, the future of conservatism, the Republican Party, all of that. Won't you please give Charlie Sykes a warm welcome to Marquette Law School. It's the second time you've been here as part of this program. I think I was it started here when you were here the last time.
Yes, we were both much younger.
Much younger.
And our hair was much darker.
It was much darker. I vaguely remember those days. I want to begin by talking about 2016. And in the first few pages of this book, How the Right Lost Its Mind, you described it, you said for you, it was, and I want to make sure I get this right, a brutal, disorienting, disillusioning slog. And then you said this book was painful for you to write. In what sense was it painful to write?
I may have even thrown in the phrase soul-crushing as well. Well, it's painful because, first of all, I wrote the book to try to figure out what the hell just happened. What was it that we had missed? How did a movement that I was part of, that I thought I understood,
the conservative movement.
How did it capitulate? How was it, first of all, taken over, and then in a more troubling way, then capitulate to not just to Donald Trump, but to Trumpism? And what's painful about it is you actually have to ask the very, very tough questions. Was this a hostile takeover? Was this a black swan event? Did Donald Trump swoop in this weird moment, take over an otherwise healthy movement? Or was it, as I conclude in the book, a pre-existing condition, that the dysfunction was a pre-existing condition? And one of the painful things to write is to ask, okay, did I contribute to this? Was I part of this? What did I miss? What did I not understand about what was happening to our movement? And of course, this went on for a very, very long time. And again, part of this book was my attempt to explore and answer those questions.
So how did you answer the question? Did I have something to do with this? What was your answer to that question?
Yes, but then so did a lot of other people. I mean, this is one of the, you look at American politics and the media, and I think there's a lot of this introspection going on. How did we miss this? What did we not understand? All of these things. And one of the things I have to ask is, were there things that the left said about conservative talk radio and conservatives that I would have rejected and pushed back on for years that might have had a grain of truth? But there's no question about it that you have to have people, I think, in the media, on the right and the left, step back and say, okay, how did we get to this moment? How did we get to this moment where I wake up every day and I look at my Twitter feed and I read the newspaper, and there's some version of this question that goes through my mind: how did we lose our minds? How did this happen? And I know that the left has its own problems. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I say in the book, the left has its own bubble, its own alternative rallies, its own crackpots. But in this book, at this moment, that's not my problem. That's your crazy uncle. I'm worried about my crazy uncle right now, and how all this happened.
I want to explore that in much greater length, but I do want to stay on the personal side of this, because one of the things I didn't say in the introduction is, and I think it is, you were arguably one of the most influential conservative voices in the state for 2 decades, perhaps a little longer than that. do you still have the same friendships? The people that you invested time and energy in, the Paul Ryans, the Reince Priebuses, the Scott Walkers, are they still friends because they have moved in a different direction than you have?
I hope so. I really, would like not to lose friends over politics. And many of the people you mentioned, I've stayed in touch with, even though we have made very, very, very different choices, and I think we've agreed to disagree. But I'll be honest with you, and I think I've said this in other venues. I do feel somewhat excommunicated from the conservative movement.
Like a person without a party, or a
well, no,
person-
and yes, I mean, I'm still, just in case there's any doubt about it, I'm still a conservative, but I'm not part of what the conservative movement has become. And that's the difficult thing, is for 20 years you feel you're part of something. I'm an only child, so I don't belong to a lot of things. But this was something that I belonged to. And then suddenly realizing, oh my goodness, they're headed in a different direction, is not the most pleasant experience to have.
A lot of this came to a head when you interviewed Donald Trump during the campaign. That interview got a lot of national attention, where you challenged then candidate Trump on a number of fronts. Did you have any sense at the time how profoundly that might change your life?
None. No, zero. First of all, I did not expect that he was going to call in that morning. I was actually working on something, trolling my former employers, because it was a long story. But I assumed that somebody in the Trump campaign would spend 10 seconds looking at my Twitter feed and would realize you don't want to go on this guy's show. So when I sat down at 8:30, I figured it was maybe 40, 60 that he would call in. He did call in, and frankly, all I did was play out the tape of everything I'd been saying about Donald Trump for the last 8 months.
You were a never Trump guy very early on.
I was a never Trump guy from the moment he came down that golden escalator. And interestingly enough, have not changed. I went back and I read some of the things I wrote in June and July of 2015, and I haven't changed my mind about any of those things. But I will say this, since we're here in Milwaukee, because it's a story that I tell elsewhere, and I don't want you to think that I tell this story anyplace else but not here. I do understand that I'm in a very different place and am treated differently by the media now than I was before. So what I tell people was, at 8 o'clock on the morning of March 28th, 2016, I was a 2-bit talk radio hack who was completely ignored by the newspaper up until that moment. I believe a journalism professor at Madison told me last week, you know that your name and Donald Trump, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel did not even ever mention that you'd even talked about Donald Trump before that day. And I don't know whether that's true or not, but basically, zero. So at 8 o'clock, I was, a talk radio squawker. By 11 o'clock that morning, I was one of the deepest thinkers in American politics. And it was an interesting experience, and I've had this experience with the media, and whether or not it's a commentary on what it's like to be a conservative who is disliked by the media versus somebody who now suddenly gets strange new respect from the media. But when the first time I was interviewed, and by several people all at the same time, Dave Weigel of the Washington Post, Ashley Parker, then of the New York Times, Eli Stokols of Politico, Daniel Dale of the Toronto Star, and we did these detailed interviews, and then they wrote stories, and I said the same thing to each one of them. I said, this is an amazing experience for me to talk to a reporter who actually wanted to know what I thought, why I thought those things, and then quoted me accurately, because this was really the first time in 23 years this has happened. When I wrote for the New York Times, I did say to the editor of the Times, you realize that for 23 years, nobody in Milwaukee media had ever asked me to write an op-ed piece before. Now, would this have happened had I not been, anti-Trump? I think unlikely, but I do have a perspective of how the media environment will change depending on whether they like you or not.
You said you haven't changed your mind about President Trump. But I'm wondering if there was ever even a scintilla of doubt that you ever thought about reconsidering your position, given what happened, where you saw prominent conservatives, prominent Republicans getting on board the Trump train. You hear Rush Limbaugh becoming you talk about this in the book, becoming a big Donald Trump guy. You see somebody like Bill Bennett, who I bet you've had a lot of respect for over the years. All of us talk about character matters. He got on board the Trump train. Friends of yours got on board. Did you ever think, man, my life would be simpler, my life would be easier, I could continue having the same sort of influence I have if I just do what the others have done?
No.
Never thought about that.
No, but because my experience was more like, and I borrowed this from Jonah Goldberg of National Review, and I give him credit for it. The year was a little bit like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. People I'd known for years suddenly, decided, well, we're going to change everything we, have believed here. You mentioned a name that was one of the most soul-crushing experiences of the year, and I talk about it in the book. And when I say it's a painful book, this is a genuinely painful moment, because among all the people that I have really respected and I've regarded as a mentor and a friend and someone that I have known personally for many, many years, Bill Bennett would rank right up there. And who wrote the Book of Virtues, spoke eloquently back in the 90s about the role of character, how the president was really one of our role models. And then in the fall of last year, he writes an essay saying that those of us who thought that character really mattered when it came to Donald Trump were indulging in mortal vanity. And that was one of those moments where you step back and go, Bill freaking Bennett. But I will say this, that there is that moment where you go, and maybe we'll get into this in a certain way. The power of tribalism in American politics is so great, and this was one of the revelations for me, particularly how it played out in Wisconsin. Those tribal loyalties and how tight they are, and the recognition that the tribe had made a decision that it was going in a certain direction, and that you were going to be cast out from the tribe. And so you have 25 years of sunken costs in that relationship. But there was not a moment when, honestly, it would have ever occurred to me that I could think that Donald Trump was fit to be president.
Do you understand why some Republicans moved in that direction? That Republicans that I talk with on my TV show or in this building, that the argument you got was, look, it's a choice between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. We want conservative Supreme Court justices. If we have a Republican, I should say, in the White House, we'll have a better chance of enacting a legislative agenda that we believe in. It's a binary choice.
Yes.
This is what we have to do.
Yeah. I have a chapter in there called The Binary Choice. And I do divide people into different categories, and I completely understand that argument. Last Sunday, I was on a panel with Rick Essenberg, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. He and I agree on 99.8% of the issues. And ultimately, he decided he was going to vote for Donald Trump on the issue of the Supreme Court. And I get that, and I respect that. I understand why he would do that. But this, of course, was this decision that it was binary, that no matter how awful Donald Trump was, no matter how somebody who insults women, who engages in racist, xenophobic rhetoric, who mocks the disabled, who lies on a serial basis, who even brags about sexual assault. But no matter how bad he is, he's not as Hillary's worse. Hillary is the worst possible person. And I think in our binary politics, we've become so tribal. I understand how people will make that decision. I would make a distinction between those people, and then there are the people like Paul Ryan, who make a more a secondary prudential decision, which is a President Donald Trump will sign my legislation. I have worked my whole life to get these kinds of reforms through. A President Hillary Clinton will not sign that. President Donald Trump will. So I make what I have described, perhaps unkindly, as a Faustian bargain, where you basically say, we're going to overlook all of this, we're going to enable this behavior because it will be worth it from a policy point of view. And then you have a third group, and we could probably divide this into 10 different subgroups, but a third group, which I would call the orange Kool-Aid drinkers, the ones who have bought into this cult of personality, who, and those are the ones that I find the most disturbing. Those are the ones who are willing to basically jettison almost every fundamental many fundamental conservative principles, who are able to ignore the character, who are willing to go along with the repudiation of Reaganism because they've caught up in this celebrity cult. And these are the ones who are defending the alternative facts and who are defending Donald Trump, for anything.
Let me follow up on that, the alternative facts. Part of this book you talk about something you call the alt-reality media and the war on truth. Define for us what you mean by alt-reality media and how much of a role you think it played in where we are today.
The second question, a huge part. In order to understand American politics, you have to understand the way in which our tribal politics is formed by two things. I mean, number one, obviously, we have separated ourselves out ideologically, but we now really have alternative reality silos of information where the right and the left inhabit different intellectual worlds, intellectual ghettos, with their own narratives, their own facts, their own stories, some of which have no relationship to truth whatsoever. The fake news aspect of this is just one part of this, but fake news, I think, begins to have an effect when it is insulated from outside information. And can I just tell the story about how I sort of came to that moment? And this was an interview that I gave in August, and I'm not sure what completely triggered it, but it was with Oliver Darcy at the time, who I can't remember who he was with anymore. But for years, I'd really been concerned about the bogus stuff that comes in over the transom. There are websites that were misleading. The chain email from your brother-in-law. And people would forward them to me, and I would push back, and I'd say, well, this is not true. This is bogus. Here's a source showing this is not true. Something changed in 2016, and I think we're only still beginning to, I felt it change, and I did not understand some of the things that I think have come out since, but something changed where it became harder and harder to push back, to say this is fake, this is false. There was this proliferation of websites, information that was going out on Facebook, and I would say, well, okay, here's a source showing that this is incorrect information. And the response would be, well, that's a liberal rag. That's the New York Times. That's the Washington Post. Or what kind of a sucker are you to be citing NBC or Snopes.com or factcheck.org? And that was the moment you realized, oh my goodness, we have succeeded in completely delegitimizing all of these media sources. The guardrails are down. There are no more referees. There's no way to penetrate inside that silo. If it's not inside the echo chamber, you can't get to it.
And when you say we, you include yourself in that by, sort of the drumbeat of be suspicious of what this media outlet's being reporting. Maybe it's not the way they're shaping their story to configure with a political philosophy?
Well, see, you and I are both journalists, recovering journalists. So, maybe as I look back on my experience, I guess I always assumed that people would make a distinction, and this is naive on my part, would make a distinction between, okay, here's bias, which exists and needed to be called out, legitimate bias. And then there's the question of, but at what point does that become the complete tearing down of any sort of credibility? Now, look, we're just here in Wisconsin, and we had a somewhat different story than the rest of the country, but clearly something had shifted in American media culture, in the way people consume information, the algorithms of Google and Facebook, just the intense the vortex of tribalism, which I know is a mixed metaphor, that we've experienced, so that you could not break into all of that. Now, the flip side, well, you want to follow that up? Because
No, go ahead.
No, I mean, the flip side of this, and I get criticized from some conservatives for not going more into detail, and I get criticized by liberals for going into the detail. I mean, look, if there's a collapse of credibility on the part of the mainstream media, I am willing to step back and say, all right, I'm willing to ask tough questions about the role that I might have played. But I also think that the media needs to step back and ask tough questions of itself. To what extent did they squander their credibility over the years? To what extent did they ignore the criticism of bias? Because when you're in the media, your number one asset has to be your credibility. And once you squander it, once you give it up, it's very, very hard to get it back. So, I'm waiting for the essays from editors of local newspapers and the heads of the network saying, all right, how did we contribute to this? What did we do? How for 20 years did we ignore many of our own constituents and customers who were telling us that they didn't think they were being treated fairly?
We've been talking about alt-reality media, as you call it, but there are a couple of other phenomena in the recent past that I want to explore a little bit with you. And one I think is a sensitive subject with you based on things I've heard you say, and this is the issue of racism, which I think you believe that over time, conservatives and Republicans are quickly labeled by the left as racist. That's a label that is thrown out, whether it's Mitt Romney or whether it's George W. Bush, that exists. And yet you write in the book that for many years, we, the right, ignored birthers, racists, truthers, and conspiracy theorists. We treated them like, as you said earlier, the crazy uncle at Thanksgiving, or the obnoxious uncle at Thanksgiving. Why didn't those folks get called out?
He's doing a great job of quoting me exactly. No, this is actually really impressive, just so you know. Okay, yeah, those are the two flip sides, and depending on which audience, I want to emphasize both. My new friends at MSNBC do not like to hear it when I say, do you understand, why in 2016 you have the rise of the alt-right? And the alt-right is a euphemism for white nationalists. I mean, these people are anti-Semites, they're bigots. Some of the things that happened during that campaign and have happened afterwards, are really shocking to the body politic. And one of the great mysteries was, well, why did conservatives tolerate this? Why did they look the other way? And I think it's a legitimate question. And there are two parts to that answer. Number one is the crying wolf issue, which you're pointing out. Look, if you are a conservative Republican, you have been called a racist for 30, 40, 50 years, depending on how old. Mitt Romney was a racist. George Bush was a racist. John McCain was a racist. Ronald Reagan was a racist. If you're in favor of low taxes, you're a racist. If you're in favor of education reform, you are a racist. So guess what? At a certain point, when the real thing comes along and you go, oh my God, those are racists, well, you've used up all the ammunition. And a lot of conservatives, I think, just sort of rolled their eyes and shrugged and said, the term racist is used to basically tell us to shut up. And so there was a numbness. Now, the flip side, which you accurately described, was it also made conservatives then numb to the fact that there really were. And they were we thought of them as the drunken uncle, at Thanksgiving who starts going on, and you say, okay, cut the beer off from Uncle Fred, turn on the Packer game, that sort of thing. But we didn't push back because we thought those were the postcards from the fringe. And you mentioned, and I write about it, you think about the role of the birther conspiracy in the rise of Donald Trump. The fact that you actually had for a while a majority of Republican voters who believed that the first African-American president was born in Kenya. And yet, by and large, we didn't do a good enough job in basically saying, look, disagree with him on policy, but we really need to confront all this. We didn't take it seriously. I think a lot of people, and I'll confess that I played a role. I mean, I tried to push back. Could I have done more? Yes. Chose peace over principle. And what happened was this came back to bite us in this year. So one of the things I say in the book is, because here's the question I get a lot, is like, why don't you just say that all Trump voters are racists? All Trump voters are bigots. Well, because first of all, number one, they're not, and that's not terribly helpful. I don't know how many Republicans, harbor racial animus, but I will tell you this, and this is the part that our group has to deal with, is that too many conservatives and Republicans are willing to tolerate and accept racial rhetoric. Look the other way. When Paul Ryan, for example, called out candidate Donald Trump for his textbook racism, attacking a Mexican-American judge, on social media on the right, he was savaged. He was basically, don't bring this stuff up. Don't do these things. So we got to the point, and I tell the story in the book of one day I was on the air, and it was during the debate over, should we ban Muslims? And a local candidate here in southeastern Wisconsin actually proposed not just banning Muslims, but rounding them up and deporting them, including American citizens. And I actually almost wanted to do this as a test case to say, okay, you guys know this is crazy, right? I mean, you understand how fundamentally wrong this is. First caller out of the box, Audrey from Oshkosh, basically said that, no, this was a great idea. They were like rabid dogs, you just got to get rid of the rabid dogs. And that was one of those moments where you go, okay, so who are these people? Have they been listening to us for 20 years? Why did we not know they were there? And is there something we said that made them think that that was acceptable?
Two other quick things on what happened. There's a chapter in here called, where did all the Christians go? But no, it's an interesting part, because evangelicals were very strong in their support of Donald Trump. Was that one of the more surprising aspects of that campaign cycle?
Well, it's funny you should ask that, because when I actually sat down to write the book, I pretty much knew what I was going to say about everything, because I'd lived it. But the one chapter that was the hardest for me was the chapter on what happened to the Christians. How did evangelical Christians look at Donald Trump and say, he's the man that we want to invest with this power. We're going to overlook all of his personal foibles. What happened to evangelical Christians who went from the one group in America that thought that personal character and personal immorality was relevant to whether someone could do their job, to the demographic group in America that thinks the least? I mean, they have completely flipped. They've gone from 70% saying, a person who is immoral in their personal life should not be trusted with government office. Now it's exactly the opposite. No group has shifted as dramatically. So why did evangelical Christians go with him? And this really does go down to the binary choice. There were principled voices like Reverend Moore, who I quote at great length, who tried to say, that, look, we are the Christian right, but the Christian part should be more important than the right. But I think this was an issue that the Democrats, the left, and the media missed. How passionate Christian evangelicals were on the issue of religious liberty, how threatened they felt, and that feeling that no matter how awful Donald Trump was, there was a chance that he would not crush them in the way that they thought that President Hillary Clinton. There was a sense that the phrase I use in the book is the left was at ramming speed, that it wasn't simply enough to win issues like gay marriage, that there was an attempt to stigmatize all religious faith, that there was an attempt to expel Christian believers from the public square. They were frightened. They felt they were being disenfranchised, and they were convinced that this was sort of their last chance. And anytime you ignore a group and you make them feel And I think other minority groups in America have felt this way as well, but they really felt under siege.
I want to talk for a moment.
I still, by the way, find that story, though, stunning.
Yeah. I want to talk to you a little bit about the notion of intimidation and bullying. Do you believe there are a significant number of conservatives or Republicans, members of Congress, for instance, who have strong fundamental disagreements with the president but are afraid to express those because of what they fear could happen to them or to their families? This is something we've talked a lot about over time, and you may have personal experience with this. What happened to you when you spoke out? And do you believe that sentiment exists, but people just don't want to express it?
Yes, absolutely. And it's crucial to understanding what's going on in American politics right now. It is the culture of intimidation. I call it the trolls and the flying monkeys that will be released on anyone who might want to take on the Trumpists. In fact,
David French, who's going to be in town on Thursday.
Classic example, the vicious attacks on him, on his wife. I was at an event in Austin, Texas over the weekend, and there were three of us who were standing around who all have been through this. And the conversation went sort of like, unless you've experienced it, you really kind of don't understand what's happening. You don't understand how awful it is. One of the guys I was talking with, and he wouldn't mind that I named him because he's not shy, Rick Wilson, during the campaign, he's a Republican consultant who is very critical of Donald Trump. They launched this massive social media campaign against him, trolling him, trying to destroy his business, everything from going through his finances to implying that his daughter had interracial child out of wedlock. I mean, this is really ugly stuff. And he carried concealed weapon to the entire campaign. David French, the same sort of thing. And I do think that there are a lot of people who make the decision, it's just not worth it to put up with it. I understand why other conservative talk show hosts and other politicians basically don't want to be outspoken because, first of all, if you're a conservative talk show host, you'll be flamed by your audience. It is not your business model. If you're a politician, your email boxes will fill up. If you're a commentator, they will target your family. They will target your finances. And I think there's a certain a certain degree of Stockholm syndrome. Now, people are familiar with that phrase because actually we were talking about things that people forget historically. That's when you begin to identify with your your hostage taker, where you see these politicians who've been insulted and beaten up and threatened. I mean, Ted Cruz. Donald Trump made fun of his wife's looks. Said that his father was involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and yet now he's a loyal supporter. It's like, okay, what is that about? People who take all this. Now, I did have one. Go look on my Facebook page, by the way, sometime just to see the reaction anytime you post anything, and it's like, you're a traitor. You're a sellout, you're a cuck conservative, which I don't want to even get into describing here. All of those things. So I think it is like this massive brushback pitch.
So how does it change? If that's where we are, how does it change? Does it change? Or have we seen a fundamental shift in the Republican Party? And I'm probably taking up too many things in one question here, but the thought does occur that there are people out there in this country who just didn't feel like the Republican Party or conservatives were delivering for them.
Right.
And so is this the new Republican Party, one that seems to have a more populist tone to it? Is this the new Republican Party, or will it go back someday?
Okay, well, let's separate out. I mean, the really ugly nastiness is not all those people that you're talking about. Yeah. I mean, you're talking about. I don't know how many of these attacks are Russian bots, as opposed to disaffected blue collar workers from Michigan, who have legitimate concerns, and that's why. I think it's possible to say the Republican Party's dysfunction was a pre-existing condition, that it was in desperate need of reforming itself, of rethinking, of getting back in touch with its constituency, and still thinking that the decision they made to embrace Donald Trump was a disaster. But yes, there's no question about it. Both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party essentially wrote off a huge portion of the electorate. You know, I remember the phrase, and everybody kept using the phrase, you know, well, you guys are the party of angry white men, and angry white men this, angry white men that. And it was never in the context of saying, let's listen to them more or find out whether they have anything to be angry about. It was always in the context of, let's start ignoring them. Well, it turns out that maybe there were reasons why people were angry. The Democratic Party became a party of essentially of academic and cultural elites and central city voters that they took for granted, ignoring the blue collar population. The Republican Party became increasingly Southern, became increasingly blue collar, but its agenda, you know, continued to be very, very corporatist. I mean, it really is when you carve out all of the rhetoric about free markets. The Republican Party, you know, is in fact, you know, lives up to some of these stereotypes of being the party of big business.
I was struck, you mentioned you were in Austin over the weekend. I was struck by something that was said by Matthew Dowd, who used to work in the George W. Bush administration. He is not a fan of the president. He made a really interesting comment. I wonder if you agree with it. He said that he thought that our political institutions no longer fit our times. That's a really interesting take on where we are. Do you share that view?
I think I was on the panel with him.
You were?
when he said that, and I wanted to find out more what he had to say about it. There's a disconnect between our political culture and our times. I think one of the things we're finding out is perhaps how fragile our institutions are.
And we take democracy as a given. That everything is, we have all these checks and balances, everything will work out.
Exactly. But you know, checks and balances is a metaphor. It's not a hard and fast thing. And I think that those of us that think that we're immune from history, that democracy and a constitutional form of government are simply preordained, I think are somewhat naive. Now, there's a very interesting debate going on about, well, you know, our institutions are so resilient they'll be able to survive all of this. I would take the skeptical point of view, I hope, by the way, they're right about all of that, and say, one of the things that I have learned over the last year, both about the conservative movement, but about cultural norms and democratic norms, is that perhaps they are pie crust thin, that they weren't as deep and broad as we actually thought they were. So here you have a president who is violating these democratic norms on a regular basis. This is not a matter of personality. This is a matter of how the system works. How many blows can we take? What are the consequences going to be 20 years from now? The lack of respect and trust in those institutions is going to be even more dramatic at the end of this term than it is at the beginning of this term, and it was already low. What does that mean for democracy? So I do think that the people who think that democracy and our system of government is a given need to recognize that this is a moment where I think it's being tested. It's being tested in a fundamental way. And I think you see that at virtually every level of government. I mean, the president, of course, runs against the media, but he also runs against, well, I think this is also part of a campaign to delegitimize every independent check that exists on the power of the presidency. And I'll also tell you, since we're talking about Austin, I had a chance to talk with two gentlemen who are very, very involved in government ethics, Walter Schaub and Richard Painter, who both, I believe, used to have the same job as head of the government ethics department. And we had the same conversation, which was that moment when Donald Trump becomes president and he says, you know, these conflict of interest laws that govern everybody else in the federal government, they don't apply to me. I'm above the law. And everybody in America, I think, sort of at the same time said, well, that's not true. No one is above the law. And then they realized, oh my God, he is above the law, that the law actually doesn't constrain. And here you have somebody who is pushing at these norms. And so I think that maybe that's what Matthew Dowd was getting at.
Real briefly, so does it return to historical norms? Is this just a aberration, a blip on the radar, a moment?
I should point out at this point that I am always the darkest person on every panel. And I always say, please, tell me that I'm wrong and tell me that I'm too pessimistic about all of this. Because I think there's two models here. There's the pendulum model, which is, okay, this is a blip, it will swing back and things will be good. The alternative is the ratchet model, that every time we lose something, every time our culture is coarsened, every time we accept the unacceptable and defend the indefensible, that we lose something. For example, and by the way, I'm leaning toward the ratchet model. Yeah. So for example, people say, well, how long are Republicans going to put up with President Trump being a serial liar, which he is? But a legitimate response is, remind me, when did Democrats break with Bill Clinton? When he was having sex in the Oval Office and when he was committing perjury. 20 years later, we're paying the price for that. There was a sense that there were certain rules and there were certain norms, and that both sides could trust those norms, that if you ever had a president who committed perjury, that it would be a no-brainer. You had a president who committed perjury and he stayed in office. Everybody thought we recovered from that, right? Except 20 years later, what happens? We have the whataboutism. What happens when people say, well, Donald Trump's a liar? Well, what about Bill Clinton? Well, Donald Trump, says that when you're a celebrity, you can grab women by the you-know-what, and this is shocking, right? Whataboutism. Well, what about 20 years earlier when you accept Bill Clinton? So 20 years from now, what is the whataboutism going to be? You lose something every time.
I'm going to take questions in about 5 minutes. I want to go through a couple of things that you're working on now, because I think this is interesting. Some people in the room may not know about that. But first of all, talking about what you're doing, I have to ask you, does it feel a little bit like sleeping with the enemy? I mean, you're on MSNBC, you're doing public radio in New York City, you're writing op-eds for the New York Times. Does it feel a little uncomfortable, or how does it feel to you now?
It feels pretty good, actually. If the alternative is...
you feel welcomed as a conservative.
Well, you know what? At no point...
Or they just love you right now because you don't like Donald Trump?
Well, okay, listen, I would be extremely naive if I did not understand that there's a strange new respect because of this. Having gone through the 20 years of being a pariah when I was a conservative and suddenly experiencing this is different. But I will say that nobody's ever asked me to say something I don't believe. I also think that there's a moment, and I will tell you that I find it incredibly liberating not to be part of the tribe. I describe myself in the book as a contrarian. Some of you in this room might have actually known my dad, Jay, who was the original contrarian. So I didn't have the tribal gene, but it's very liberating to be able to have conversations with people across the political spectrum and not be locked into all that. So I do appreciate that. And to a certain extent, when I do some of this stuff, the response that I like the most is when I hear from people going, wow, I'm so glad there's a rational conservative, or I'd never heard a conservative idea expressed that way before. I also think that there is right now this moment where there's a Venn diagram. If you had a Venn diagram between left and right, the overlap between liberals and conservatives is very small, but it's really important what we have an overlap on, and so that dialogue is interesting.
So I got to ask you this question because I'm sure you've heard it, and I think you hear it more in the Milwaukee area. There are some people who will say, I'm not sold on the new Charlie Sykes. He's found a way to recreate himself. He's found a way to market himself. He's made it a very smart career decision. So they question the sincerity of your convictions and the things you're saying today. What do you say to those people?
Well, to be honest, I understand. I would try to put myself in the position if this was somebody else, what did I used to say about David Brooks or David Frum, those folks. But I will say this, I am saying exactly the same thing that I've been saying for 2 years. You can't find, I do think it's interesting, there's another talk show host in town who continues to make hundreds of thousands of dollars saying the exact opposite of what he said a year ago. But he says that I'm the sellout for saying the exact same thing. I haven't changed anything. So basically, I mean, I enjoy some of the work that I'm doing, but the notion that it has been somehow opportunistic, show me what I've changed my position on. I just happen to say it on a different and larger platform.
Here's my final question. Two different ventures you're involved with, and we were talking about this upstairs before we came down. Kind of interesting. One of them is you're now on the advisory board of the Knight Foundation, which is going to invest millions of dollars into looking at why the public's trust in the media has diminished to the extent it has. How did you get involved in that?
Well, they invited me to be on it. This is something. It's a joint effort of the Aspen Institute and the Knight Foundation, and they put together a commission. I think they talk about dealing with the media, democracy, and trust, recognizing this moment we're in right now. I'm on the advisory board of the Democracy Fund, which is working on all of this. I've written about these issues, and I do think that there's an effort right now to create a bipartisan forum to say, okay. We need to talk to conservatives and liberals and figure out what went wrong. Let's listen to these different points of view, and what do we do to turn it around? How do we become a fact-based society? And I think the one assumption we all share is that in order for democracy to be vital and effective, it has to be factually based. We have to have respect for truth. The loss of respect for truth is not compatible with the democratic society. And journalism and trust in fact-based journalism is going to be central to all of that. So I don't know what they're going to come up with, but I think it's going to be, it's an important effort.
And you're also involved with something, and this is the one that I kind of chuckled about, but Rob Reiner, the director, no one will, I'll talk about Archie Bunker, but no one will remember that, so.
You remember Meathead.
So Rob Reiner is I'm sure in conservative ranks would be considered a big L liberal. But he's got this committee to investigate Russia, and you're on the advisory board. And it's a really interesting advisory board, too. It's got some pretty heavyweight people on it. How did you end up connecting with Rob Reiner?
He called me. And it was like, okay, this is weird, because we agree on probably nothing, except this, that he is on the left and he's out there, and he said, look, I'm trying to put together a group of people across the political spectrum who care about the fact that we were attacked by Russia, who are going to put country over party. And I'm talking with people like James Clapper. I'm talking with David Frum and some other people, Max Boot, people who I'm close with.
Farkas. Mm-hmm.
All of these folks. And he said, would you be willing to participate? And I basically kind of put him off on it because I don't like joining things. I don't. I mean, honestly, I don't like to get involved in being on something like this. But as this played out, it just occurs to me that I am old enough to remember, in fact, we were talking about that we've known each other for 40 years, speaking of being old. But I'm old enough to remember, when Ronald Reagan was president. I'm old enough to remember when conservative Republicans would have cared deeply about the fact that the Russians tried to hack our election, that they staged an attack on this country's democracy, that the Russians actually are trying to destabilize our system. This is not a left-wing issue. This is something that people ought to care about. So if you say you care about it and you need to stand up, and somebody reaches out and said, would you help this effort, and what Reiner is doing, and he's got the Morgan Freeman video, if you've seen this. He's basically saying is, look, this is not left wing or right wing. This is going to be a clearinghouse for information, so that people who are trying to keep up with it, and it's hard to keep up with all of the different developments, to keep up with it, to inform people and to make sure that factual information is out there. And I thought, why not? This again is this Venn diagram. If he's willing to reach out to me on my side, then this is good. I'm willing to work. Now that doesn't mean that I've shifted over to his political side. It just shows that we can actually work together, and that there is actually I think a patriotic center is probably the wrong word, but a patriotic nexus here where we can work together.
Let's take some questions from the audience. If you're in the lower seating bowl, please press down on the rim, not on the ball, but on the rim. Keep your finger down on the rim. We'll all be able to hear your question. If you're in the back, Ryan has a microphone. He will hold it for you. Here's what I'm going to say. Please keep your questions really brief. If you're going to give a speech, I'm going to have to interrupt. I really don't want to do that, but keep the questions brief. We'll try to get to 3 or 4 of them. Ryan, let's get the guy right back here. He was so eager.
I'm wondering if you could comment on the role of just technology and particularly social media, where there was once a gatekeeping function that the traditional media played, and now if you've got a smartphone and a pair of thumbs, you can be part of the discussion.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's an excellent question, and it's the center of a lot of what we're talking about here. And the way the environment has changed, and it's changed so radically. At first, the democratization of the media, I thought was an outstanding and a wonderful thing, and I still think it is. When I was in conservative talk radio in the early years, one of the things that I really liked about it was we are now breaking the monopoly of the mainstream media. It used to be that you'd have, executives in 3 major networks who decided what you were going to read, the editors decided. Now, of course, you have this explosion of different voices, which, how could that not be a great thing, right? To have 1,000 flowers bloom, to quote Chairman Mao. And yet somehow that has morphed into all of these voices, many of them grotesquely irresponsible and propagandistic. And the real crisis that we face now is, how do we know what's true? Who do we listen to? Where are the referees? And there are people who are willing to take advantage of this. I don't know how you put the genie back in the bottle. That's one of the reasons why I agreed to be part of this Knight Commission. There are people who say it's just simply because the truth has not been loud enough. But yeah, you're exactly right. And I spent a good deal of time in the book talking about what has happened to the media, but also trying to distinguish what's old and what's new. Look, a lot of this stuff's been happening for a long, long, long time. A lot of this back and forth with the mainstream media, and conservatives being disillusioned, this goes back decades and decades and decades. But it'd be a mistake not to recognize how fundamentally and rapidly things are changing and have changed within the last maybe year and a half. And I think scholars and researchers are only, fully getting their heads around that now.
Let me take other questions. Let me go right here. Hang on one second, we'll bring you a microphone, yes.
So I just want to say one thing. I really respect that you early and often were a never Trump person. But my question is this: we've all become so deadened to the outrageous things that are going on in Washington right now, and we attribute it to Trump. And you talked a little bit about, character matters. When do we start to shift and say, Paul Ryan, Reince Priebus, Scott Walker, it's outrageous that you're not taking a stand against all of this, that legislation or victories or whatever they're doing, whatever reason they're using to be silent on this, that we start to question their character.
Well, no, I've probably been asked that question about 100 times on MSNBC. And you keep hoping that there's going to come a moment where you draw that bright red line. But let's be honest about it. So Donald Trump sends out some deeply offensive tweets. Is Paul Ryan going to give up on tax reform because of that? Are they not going to pass a budget because of that? What form does that take? Will there be more of a willingness to do it? I think the thing to watch is that as long as the Republican base is solidly behind Trump, which it is, and it's in the 80%, you're not going to see elected officials willing to break with Trump. That's just a political reality. And I must admit, I winced when I said to an interviewer who published it that I always think of that line from A Man for All Seasons. Remember we're saying, Thomas More says to Richard Rich, what profits it a man to lose his soul if he gains the whole world, but for whales, because he'd given up. And then I said, well, in my head, I'm always hearing, but for tax cuts, Paul. And I know that's a little bit harsh, but I do think that there are a lot of conservatives who think, look, it's worth it to get a good Supreme Court justice. I get that, and I don't expect that they're going to give that up, but you always have to ask, what is the price? What is the butcher's bill? How far are they willing to go? And I'll let you know when we get to that point.
Other questions?
You'll probably know it first, though.
Yes? There you go.
One of the things that I heard during the election, and I can't remember how far along, if it was after after it was just Trump or before there were other candidates, was a commentator say that Trump is the result of political correctness run amok. And I sat back and thought about that, and I think that was maybe the best comment that ever came out of anybody who tried to analyze the situation from my point of view. So I just thought maybe you could comment on that and your thoughts.
Thank you.
That's actually one of the most frustrating parts of this campaign, because I've actually written about political correctness for more than 20 years. This has been something that I pounded away at all the time, and I do think it's legitimate to push back. And during this campaign, to see that phrase hijacked and distorted the way it was, I do think that a lot of people, you would have asked them, why are you supporting Donald Trump? It is specifically because they thought they were pushing back. But sometimes, and this is where making distinctions is important, you go to your aunt's dinner and you belch out loud. Somebody might say that's politically incorrect. Well, yes, but it's also like just really vulgar and rude. And I think that a lot of bad behavior started to be justified because it was politically, incorrect. So, for example, banning Muslims or saying that all Muslims should be expelled. Well, we can't be politically correct. Like, whoa, wait, is that what we really meant? But I do think there was a pushback on all of that. Look, I do think that the conservatives legitimately can be accused of being reactionary, but they had something to react against. And I do think that this pressure, don't say this, don't tell this joke, don't have these thoughts, don't express these things, there was a tremendous pushback to all of that. And unfortunately, it manifested itself in inappropriate ways.
I'm going to take one more question. Yes?
Can I do this?
Yeah, you bet.
What sustains you in all of this chaos and complexity that is surrounding you? You're caught in a maelstrom, and no amount of books or all of that really takes care of your needs and your being able to sustain what you're doing, because it is very different than what I remember when I would never watch your program. And now no, seriously, I long to see you and a couple of other people and hear what you have to say, because it's very sober, it's very measured, it's very critically aware.
Thank you.
I don't know I actually feel pretty passionate about this stuff, and I'm relatively confident that I'm going to be proven right about Donald Trump at some point. But also, I do feel an obligation to sort of explain myself, to say, look, I'm a conservative, and this is not what we meant. This is not where we were going. There is an alternative. Now, I do think that, and I've had this conversation with George Will, this recognition that there weren't as many of us as we thought. As he told me, he said, we were a much smaller band of brothers and sisters, and we kind of got to stick together now. And it's like, we were much smaller than we thought we were. But also, I will tell you, I do think that we're at this pivotal moment. I do think we're being tested. I think the democracy is being tested. I think our character is being tested. And this is one of those moments where you have to stand up. There are these moments you identify in history, where were you at this moment? What was the position you took at this moment? And I think this is one of them. And the other thing is I'm just so horrified by a lot of the people that I used to be allied with, the people that I thought of as my friends, who decided they aren't going to speak up about that. So I feel that puts more of an obligation. Now, can I just say one I know we're running out of time, but one of the amazing things that happened in Wisconsin was, keep in mind, how different we were than the rest of the country. That we voted overwhelmingly against Trump, we being conservative Republicans in this state, that up until April of last year, I was very much in the mainstream of the conservative movement here. His approval rating was about 26% here in southeastern Wisconsin among Republicans. People in Wisconsin voted for Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz is not a good fit for Wisconsin. Nobody in Wisconsin likes Ted Cruz. But they voted for Ted Cruz strategically to stop Donald Trump. So on April 5th, I think Wisconsin Republicans really distinguished themselves from what was happening around the rest of the country. But then I watched throughout the rest of the year how one after another everybody fell in line because of this binary choice, this tribal politics. And that was an extraordinary experience for me, to watch how that happened one after another. I used to be a sponsor of a thing called the Right Women Awards to advance conservative women in Wisconsin. We gave awards to just about every prominent, successful conservative woman in the state. It was one of the reasons why I was horrified by Donald Trump and his treatment. But I will tell you that I believe, you can PolitiFact me on this, that every single woman that we gave an award to ended up supporting and endorsing Donald Trump. So I'm still trying to get over all this, to be quite honest.
I'm going to wrap things up there. Before we go, just a couple of things. And one of these items is bad news, disappointing news. On Thursday afternoon, we were going to hear from Hugh Hewitt, also a talk radio host who has landed in a different place than Charlie Sykes has. But he had a family medical emergency, and so because of that, he is staying to do some family business back in California. So he will not be with us on Thursday if you were planning to attend that. We apologize, and we hope that we'll get him back here at some point in the future. We would love to have him. Also, coming up, we ask you to continue to check our schedule, law.marquette.edu, for upcoming On the Issues events. We'll be adding 2 or 3 more. We've got some really good stuff coming up in the next few weeks. Amy Goldstein, a Washington Post reporter, wrote a great book on Janesville and what happened to Janesville after the closing of the GM plant. Will be here. We still have just a few seats left for that. So continue to check the schedule, and we hope you'll find something that interests you and you'll return. Having said that, as we always do, thanks very much for spending time with us, for your attention, for your good questions. We appreciate that, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time on The Issues. Most of all, Charlie Sykes, thanks very much.
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah, thank you.